Diane Keaton, a woman whose name echoed through Hollywood for decades, quietly closed her eyes for the final time in the same house that once hosted her fondest memories. The woman who once graced the silver screen with her wit and elegance, who redefined love and loss in front of millions, chose to leave the world in silence. No fanfare, no interviews, no farewell tour, just the whisper of her final decision. Her son, Duke, now stands as the reluctant keeper of her story, not as a grieving child, but as a man compelled by a need to share the final truth. The story the world never got to hear. Diane Keaton didn't die like other legends. She faded into the quiet. She didn't seek the spotlight one last time. Instead, she left behind clues, hidden in forgotten letters and dog-eared books, secret messages only now revealed. She had chosen this, to leave with grace, to close her chapter without the eyes of the world watching her. Duke reveals that for months before her passing, Diane had begun leaving small marks on the world around her. Books with poignant quotes, pictures hidden away in old envelopes, letters that were never sent. And one night, she simply stopped, sitting in her favorite chair, facing the window, never to rise again. What had truly happened in the final years of Diane Keaton's life? The years when she decided to withdraw from the public, to turn away from the relentless attention, the glamorous images of a life she no longer wished to lead? Was this silence a sign of surrender or an act of quiet rebellion? Her career had been built on the fragile balance of vulnerability and strength, a woman who let the world see just enough of her to love her, but never the entirety. Diane was never fully known, not even by those closest to her. Her son reflects on this, sharing how in their home, Diane wasn't an icon, but a woman who loved simple things. A cup of coffee without sugar, hats worn indoors, and the quiet contemplation of old photographs as if they were windows to another life. She wore her fame like a heavy cloak, but she never allowed it to define her in private. Through the eyes of those who loved her, Diane Keaton's silence in her final years was not the absence of love or life, but rather a conscious choice to withdraw, to reclaim her privacy. She refused to be pitted, refused to be reduced to a headline. And it was in these final, quiet moments that she found her true freedom. Diane's story is not one of a Hollywood diva fading away. It is the story of a woman reclaiming her narrative, choosing to leave the stage on her own terms. And now, after all these years, we listen, not as fans, but as witnesses to the private life of the woman who was, in the end, more than just Annie Hall. Diane Keaton's life was not a fairy tale. It was an intricate story of contradictions, grace, and hidden struggles. Behind the famous roles and iconic moments in Hollywood, there was a woman grappling with the weight of expectations and her own quiet rebellion. Born in Los Angeles in 1946, she was always different. From a young age, Diane stood apart from the crowd, a woman who refused to conform to the traditional norms that Hollywood desperately tried to impose on her. While others embraced the glamour, she resisted, determined to carve out a space where she could be herself. Raised in a household that valued discipline and intellect, Diane's childhood was anything but typical. Her father, a real estate developer, expected his children to achieve great things, but Diane was never one to follow the standard path. She wasn't the star athlete, nor the popular girl at school. Instead, she was the dreamer, the thinker, the one who would lose herself in books, in music, in a world of her own creation. She was a girl who would find solace in the silence of her room, reading, imagining, and dreaming of something greater than what the world around her could offer. Her journey into acting was not one of instant fame. In fact, it took years of auditioning, of rejection, before Diane found her place. She wasn't the typical Hollywood ingenue. She didn't fit the mold of the beautiful, docile leading lady. Diane was quirky, awkward even, with an offbeat charm that was not immediately recognized. It was this very uniqueness, however, that would eventually make her one of the most beloved and respected actresses in Hollywood. In her early years, she was like any other struggling artist, working odd jobs, attending auditions, and trying to get her big break. But the break didn't come easily. In fact, Diane often doubted herself, wondering if she would ever be more than a face in the crowd. She didn't have the striking beauty that many of her contemporaries had, nor the fame to back her up. But she had something else: talent, persistence, and a refusal to give in to the industry's pressures. And eventually, the world took notice. It was her role in The Godfather that changed everything. Playing the role of Kay Adams, the wife of Michael Corleone, Diane Keaton became a household name. She was no longer just a struggling actress, but the face of a new era of women in cinema. Her performance was subtle, complex, and undeniably powerful. Diane didn't have to play the role of the damsel in distress or the seductress. She was the grounded woman who represented a different kind of strength. Her performance in The Godfather would become iconic, but it was also a moment that defined her career. She was not just an actress. She was an enigma, a mystery wrapped in a persona that few could fully decode. Yet, as her career soared, so too did the challenges of living under the microscope. Diane never truly embraced the idea of being a star in the traditional sense. She didn't live for the glamour or the press. She lived for the work. Her passion for acting was not about winning awards or receiving adoration, but about the craft itself. This sometimes put her at odds with the very industry that had made her famous. In many ways, Diane Keaton was an outsider in Hollywood, a place where conformity often reigned supreme. She refused to be shaped by the pressures of fame. While other actresses struggled to maintain their youth and beauty, Diane chose to age gracefully, unapologetically. She continued to work, but her roles began to reflect the complexity of her own personal journey. She wasn't playing the ingenue anymore. She was playing women who had lived, who had experienced loss, love, and heartbreak. Despite her success, Diane's personal life was marked by a deep loneliness. She was often alone, surrounded by the trappings of fame, but disconnected from it all. Her relationships were fleeting, intense, and ultimately unsatisfying. Diane never married, and she often spoke about the difficulty of balancing a career in Hollywood with a desire for a fulfilling personal life. Her relationships with men, most notably her famous romance with Woody Allen, were always complicated, marked by a tension between her independence and a need for love. But love, for Diane, was always elusive. She seemed to attract men who were just as complicated as she was, but none could truly break through the wall she had built around herself. Her work, however, was where she found solace. Diane poured herself into her roles, inhabiting each character with an intensity that few actresses could match. She was a master of subtlety, of conveying complex emotions with a single glance or a brief pause. Whether in Annie Hall, Reds, or Manhattan, Diane Keaton became synonymous with the kind of woman who was both strong and vulnerable, confident and unsure, passionate and afraid. She played women who were living, breathing contradictions, just like herself. But as the years passed, Diane began to pull away from the spotlight. Hollywood had a way of discarding its aging stars, and Diane, ever the rebel, was not going to let herself become another casualty of the system. She began to retreat, to say no to offers, to turn down roles. She stopped attending the glamorous events that once defined her life. Diane Keaton didn't need the applause anymore. She had learned to find peace in the quiet moments, in the spaces between her performances, in the solitude of her home. But this retreat was not a sign of defeat. It was a choice. Diane chose to live life on her own terms, to find meaning outside of the superficial world of fame and fortune. She spent her final years reflecting on her life, on her career, on the choices she had made. And as she looked back, she realized that the life she had lived was one of rare authenticity, a life that was hers alone, unburdened by the expectations of others. Diane Keaton was a woman who lived in the public eye, but always kept her private self hidden away. She was a star, yes, but she was also a woman who longed for peace, for quiet, for a life that was not dictated by the whims of Hollywood. In the end, she chose to leave in the way she had lived, silently, without fanfare, but with a legacy that would live on forever. In the final years of Diane Keaton's life, the world saw only the smallest sliver of her personal battles. The woman who once danced on the silver screen, whose laugh was as unforgettable as her iconic roles, had retreated into herself. She had chosen to live in seclusion, away from the prying eyes of Hollywood and the insistent calls of the media. But her silence, however intentional, was not a complete absence. It was, in fact, a deliberate act of control over a life that had been far too public for too long. During these years, Diane faced her greatest challenges, not on a movie set or on a red carpet, but in the quiet solitude of her home. The woman who had once shared her every moment with the world, who had reveled in the attention and the applause, now sought refuge in her own private world. She began to withdraw from public life, slowly, almost imperceptibly. At first, it was just small things. She stopped attending the events, the glamorous parties that had been so much a part of her life. The invitations from film festivals and charity galas piled up, but Diane had already made her decision. She would no longer be a part of that world. Instead, she chose a quieter existence, one that seemed almost antithetical to the image that the world had built for her. The vibrant, effervescent woman who had once been the epitome of Hollywood glamour was now a woman who had retreated into the shadows, seeking peace in a life that no longer required her to perform. Her home, once filled with the noise of a bustling career, now echoed with a quiet emptiness. There were no more photo shoots, no more interviews, no more rehearsals. She spent her days in her garden, tending to the roses, walking barefoot through the grass, and sitting in front of the large windows that let the light pour in. There, in the stillness, Diane found her own form of solace. But even as she withdrew from the public eye, her inner world was far from peaceful. Diane's silence, which the world saw as a withdrawal, was in truth an internal battle, a battle against herself. She had spent decades building a life based on public perception, on fame, and on the need to be seen and celebrated. But in her final years, Diane grappled with the profound loneliness that had always lingered beneath the surface. She was no longer the radiant star. She was just Diane Keaton, a woman with a past that she had long tried to escape and a future she had never fully embraced. The pain of this internal conflict was exacerbated by the deep sense of loss that had crept into her life over the years. Diane had lived through love, loss, and heartbreak in ways that few could understand. Her relationships had always been intense, but fleeting. She had loved with the fullness of her being, but those loves had been imperfect, broken by the weight of her own independence and her fear of losing herself in someone else. Her romantic relationships had always been deeply complicated, perhaps none more so than with Woody Allen, a relationship that had both defined her career and left her emotionally scarred. In the years after their breakup, Diane was faced with a reality that was both a blessing and a curse. She was a Hollywood icon, admired by millions, but privately, she struggled with feelings of isolation. She was often alone in her home, surrounded by her achievements, yet still yearning for something more. The loneliness she felt was not the kind that came from being forgotten, but rather from never truly being known. Diane's life had been a series of roles, both on screen and off, and now, in her final years, she longed for a sense of clarity, a sense of peace that had always eluded her. It was during this period that she began to reflect more deeply on her life, particularly on her childhood, her family, and the choices she had made. She started to write more frequently, filling notebook after notebook with her thoughts, her fears, and her hopes. It was through writing that she began to process the pain she had carried for so long, the pain of never quite fitting in, of always being a little different from those around her. In her journals, Diane explored the loneliness that had shadowed her since childhood, the loneliness that had driven her to seek fame and recognition, only to discover that those things could never fill the emptiness inside her. The more she wrote, the more she came to terms with the fact that her need for fame had always been a response to her inner sense of inadequacy. Diane had spent so much of her life seeking validation from the world, but in the end, she realized that it was the internal validation that truly mattered. She had spent years on the outside looking in, but now, in the final chapters of her life, she was forced to confront the truths she had avoided. Her fame, her success, these were not the things that defined her. The quiet moments she had spent with her family, the love she had shared, and the friendships she had built, these were the things that truly mattered. Despite her withdrawal from the public eye, Diane was not completely alone in her final years. Her son, Duke, was by her side, witnessing the complexity of his mother's struggle. He saw the woman who had been so strong, so independent, now grappling with the inevitable passage of time. He saw the woman who had always been so guarded, now beginning to let down her walls, if only just a little. And as he watched her retreat further into herself, he also saw a woman who was coming to terms with the life she had led and the life she was leaving behind. In the days leading up to her death, Diane's condition began to worsen. She had long struggled with a form of chronic illness, one that had slowly drained her strength over the years. But Diane, ever the fighter, refused to be defined by her illness. She chose to live her final days on her own terms, away from the gaze of the world, in the place where she had always felt most at peace, her home. She spent her last days quietly, surrounded by the things she loved, in a state of reflection and acceptance. She was ready, not in the way one might expect, but in the way that someone who has lived a full and complex life might be, with grace, with dignity, and with a quiet sense of peace. In her final moments, Diane Keaton was not the Hollywood star who had once captured the hearts of millions. She was not the woman who had danced across the screen in countless iconic films. She was not the public figure who had once been the center of attention. She was simply a woman who had lived, who had loved, and who had made her peace with the life she had led. Diane had chosen her ending, and she had done so in the only way she knew how, on her own terms. And as Duke sat by her side, he knew that her final act had been one of quiet rebellion, of choosing to leave a world that had never truly understood her, and to do so in a way that would ensure her story would not be defined by the fame that had once consumed her, but by the woman who had always lived in the shadows of that fame. The impact of Diane Keaton's decision to withdraw from the public was felt not only by those closest to her, but also by the world she had left behind. In the days following her passing, a mix of disbelief and admiration spread throughout Hollywood as people began to process the life of a woman who had lived on her own terms. While many saw her as an icon, a symbol of independence and grace, the truth of her life was far more complex. Diane Keaton was not just a Hollywood star. She was a woman who had spent years grappling with the weight of her fame, her solitude, and her deeply personal struggles. For those who had known her well, the loss was not just the passing of an actress, but of a person who had always kept her true self hidden behind the mask of her public persona. Diane had always been fiercely private, even as her fame grew. While she had opened her heart to her closest friends and family, there remained a part of her that was forever veiled, forever distant. In her final years, as she quietly faded away from the limelight, it became clear that her retreat had been a way to protect herself, not only from the scrutiny of the world, but also from the very expectations she had helped create. Her son, Duke, was perhaps the person most profoundly affected by her withdrawal. While he had always been her son, the lines between mother and child had blurred in the final months of her life. He had witnessed firsthand the woman who had once been full of vitality, now struggling with a disease that took away her physical strength. But it was not just her health that had changed. Duke saw the emotional toll it took on her, how she wrestled with the duality of being a public figure and a private person, how she longed for a peace that had always eluded her. The impact of Diane's retreat from the public was felt not just by those closest to her, but by the fans who had watched her grow into a beloved Hollywood icon. The world mourned the loss of the woman who had embodied so much of what they adored in cinema. Her career, which spanned decades and was defined by her unique approach to acting, had brought her worldwide fame. Yet in her final years, she had chosen to retreat from that very world. For many, it was hard to reconcile the Diane they had come to know on screen with the woman who had become a recluse, keeping to herself in a world she had once so eagerly embraced. But the loss of Diane Keaton was more than just a personal one. It was a reminder of the fragility of fame, of the fact that even those who seem to have everything can find themselves isolated and in search of something more meaningful. Her death brought attention to the deeper struggles that often accompany the glamorous lives of Hollywood stars. The internal conflicts, the pressures of living up to public expectations, and the emotional toll that constant scrutiny can take on an individual. Diane had lived a life of great achievement, yet in the end, she had chosen to leave it all behind, to embrace a quiet, private departure that would define her legacy in a way few could have predicted. For the world that had once adored her, the pain of her loss was compounded by the realization that Diane Keaton had left us with more questions than answers. What drove her to retreat from the world that had made her famous? Was it the pain of her personal struggles, the weight of her public persona, or a deeper desire for peace that she could no longer find? These were questions that no one but Diane could answer, and yet, in her final moments, she had chosen silence, not just as a departure from the spotlight, but as a way to leave a final statement about the kind of life she had lived. Her decision to withdraw, to let go of the world she had once belonged to, had a profound effect on the people around her. Her friends, her family, and even those who had admired her from afar were left to grapple with the implications of her choice. For Duke, it was an emotional reckoning, a chance to understand his mother as a woman, not just as a star. He had always admired her strength, but in the final years of her life, he came to appreciate the vulnerability that had always been beneath the surface. Diane Keaton, the woman who had always been larger than life, was, in the end, just a person who had lived with both triumph and heartbreak, and who had chosen to face her final moments with the same quiet dignity that had defined her throughout her career. In the wake of her death, many began to reflect on the legacy Diane had left behind. She had been a trailblazer in Hollywood, a woman who had redefined what it meant to be a leading lady. She had challenged the norms of her time, defying expectations with her unique style and her refusal to conform to the traditional image of beauty. But beyond her professional achievements, it was her personal journey, her struggles with loneliness, her search for meaning, and her eventual retreat into solitude that resonated most deeply with those who had followed her life and career. Diane Keaton had always been a symbol of strength, but in her final years, she became a symbol of something more, the courage to live authentically, even when the world demanded a different version of her. Her legacy was not just about the film she had made or the role she had played. It was about the way she had lived her life, the choices she had made, and the way she had, in her final moments, chosen peace over fame. As the world came to terms with her death, the legacy of Diane Keaton became clearer than ever. She had lived a life that was, at times, painful, but ultimately, it was her own. And in the end, that was the most powerful legacy she could have left behind. As the years passed, Diane Keaton's name remained synonymous with grace, strength, and a certain kind of enigmatic beauty. Yet, beneath the surface of the public persona she had so carefully crafted, there was a life that most people would never know. Her journey, one marked by iconic roles and public adoration, had also been a deeply personal battle, an internal struggle that she kept largely hidden from the world. Those closest to her, particularly her family, were the only ones who truly understood the depth of her complexity. In her final years, Diane's retreat into solitude revealed a side of her that had long been concealed. She had always been a woman of contradictions, a fierce, independent spirit, yet also deeply vulnerable, a Hollywood star, yet a private individual who yearned for peace. As her fame grew, so did the weight of expectation. Diane had become a symbol of strength and resilience, a woman who faced life's challenges head-on. But behind the public image, there were moments of doubt, sorrow, and loneliness that she kept to herself. In the quiet of her home, Diane found comfort in the small, seemingly insignificant moments. Her garden became a sanctuary, a place where she could escape the noise of the world and reconnect with herself. There, she would tend to the roses, the flowers, and the plants, finding solace in the simple act of nurturing life. It was in these moments, surrounded by nature, that Diane could finally breathe away from the cameras and the expectations of the world. But her retreat was not just about physical isolation. It was also an emotional withdrawal, a decision to disconnect from a world that had once consumed her. For years, Diane had lived under the bright spotlight of Hollywood, but as time passed, she found herself longing for something more, a sense of peace, a deeper connection to herself and her family. The very fame that had once made her a household name now seemed like a distant memory, something she had grown weary of. Her decision to step away from the limelight was not an act of defeat, but one of self-preservation. Diane's private journals, which she had kept hidden for years, were filled with thoughts and reflections that gave insight into the woman behind the roles. She had always been a woman of profound depth, but she had never shared her innermost thoughts with the world. The journals were a window into her soul, a place where she could express her fears, her regrets, and her hopes for the future. Some of the entries were filled with sadness, as Diane grappled with the loneliness that had always been a part of her life. Despite her success, she often felt disconnected from the world around her, unable to fully connect with others in a meaningful way. But there were also moments of hope, of self-reflection, and of quiet acceptance. Diane had always been a woman who sought understanding, both of herself and of the world around her. In her journals, she expressed a longing for peace, for the ability to reconcile her public life with her private one. She wrote about the difficulties of balancing her career with the desire to live a more grounded life, away from the constant scrutiny of the press and the expectations of others. Her struggles were not just external, but internal as well. Diane had spent much of her life trying to prove herself, both to others and to herself. She had achieved great success in Hollywood, but at what cost? The fame, the adoration. These were things she had once craved, but over time, they began to feel like chains that held her captive. She longed for a sense of freedom, for the ability to live her life on her own terms, without the pressure to be someone she wasn't. This internal conflict was most evident in her relationships. Diane had always been fiercely independent, yet she yearned for connection, for intimacy. Her romantic relationships, though intense, were often short-lived. Diane had loved deeply, but she was also terrified of losing herself in someone else. She had often spoken about her fear of being consumed by another person, of losing her sense of self in the process of loving someone else. This fear had been a constant theme in her relationships, and it was something that she struggled to overcome. Despite the challenges she faced, Diane never gave up on love. She continued to search for connection, even as she withdrew from the public eye. In her final years, she found comfort in the presence of her family, particularly her son, Duke. He had witnessed firsthand the complexities of her life, the way she balanced her public persona with her private struggles. Through him, Diane was able to experience a sense of love and connection that had eluded her for so long. Diane's decision to step away from Hollywood was not just about rejecting fame, but about reclaiming her own narrative. She had spent decades living under the microscope, constantly trying to meet the expectations of others. But in her final years, she chose to define her own path. She wanted to be remembered not just as an actress, but as a woman who had lived authentically, who had faced her struggles with grace and dignity. Her legacy was not just in the role she had played, but in the way she had lived her life. Diane Keaton had always been a woman of quiet strength, of independence and resilience. But she was also a woman who had known great pain, great loss, and great loneliness. Her decision to retreat from the public was her way of finding peace, of reclaiming the space to heal and to reflect. In her final moments, Diane Keaton was not the Hollywood star who had once graced the red carpets, nor the woman who had captured the hearts of millions. She was simply a woman who had lived her life to the fullest, who had loved deeply, and who had found peace in her final years. And as her story came to a close, it was clear that Diane Keaton's true legacy was not in the film she made or the fame she achieved, but in the way she chose to live her life, and in the way she chose to leave it. As Diane Keaton's life quietly came to its end, many were left to reflect not only on the role she played, but also on the profound silence that had defined her final years. Her decision to withdraw from the public eye, to retreat into the quiet solitude of her home, was a powerful statement, one that resonated deeply with those who knew her and those who admired her from afar. She had lived her life on her own terms, and even in her final days, she chose a path that few could truly understand. Diane Keaton's story was one of contrasts, glamour and solitude, fame and isolation, strength and vulnerability. Her career had been defined by her ability to balance these opposing forces, to create characters that were both complex and relatable. But behind the scenes, Diane's life was marked by a quiet struggle with her own identity and the pressure of living up to the expectations of both Hollywood and the world. She was, in many ways, a prisoner of her own success, caught between the desire for love and connection and the need for independence and solitude. Her retreat from the public was not just about escaping the pressures of fame. It was a deeper search for meaning and purpose in the later years of her life. Diane had always been a seeker, a woman who was constantly questioning, reflecting, and searching for something more. In the final years, this search became even more pronounced. She wasn't seeking validation from the world anymore. She had already achieved that. Instead, she was seeking peace, a peace that could only come from within. Diane's decision to leave Hollywood was also a reflection of her growing disillusionment with the industry that had made her famous. Hollywood had always been a place where beauty, youth, and conformity were prized above all else. But Diane, in her own quiet way, had always defied those standards. She was never the traditional Hollywood beauty, never the ingenue, and never the type to fit neatly into the box that the industry tried to place her in. And while that had worked in her favor for much of her career, by the end, it had become a burden. She had witnessed firsthand how the industry chewed up and spit out its stars, how it discarded people when they no longer fit the mold. Diane had always been aware of this, but it became even more evident to her as she aged. She had seen her peers struggle to maintain their relevance, to fight against the passage of time. And in the end, she had made the decision to step away before she was pushed out, before she became a victim of the very system that had once elevated her to such heights. But it wasn't just Hollywood that had worn her down. It was the constant scrutiny, the relentless demands of fame, and the emotional toll that came with being in the public eye for so long. Diane had always been someone who valued her privacy, who cherished the moments when she could step away from the spotlight and simply be herself. But as her fame grew, those moments became harder and harder to find. She was constantly being asked to perform, to be something she was no longer sure she wanted to be. And so, in the final years of her life, she made the difficult decision to step away, to disappear from the world that had once consumed her. In the years that followed, Diane's retreat became a source of reflection for those who had followed her career. People began to realize that her decision to leave the limelight was not one of defeat, but one of empowerment. She had chosen to live her life on her own terms, to define her own narrative, and to find peace in a world that had often demanded more of her than she was willing to give. Diane's legacy, therefore, was not just in the role she had played, but in the way she had lived her life. She had shown the world that it was possible to be true to oneself, even in the face of immense pressure. She had proved that one could step away from fame, from the expectations of others, and still leave behind a lasting impact. And perhaps most importantly, Diane had demonstrated that it was possible to find peace in a world that often seemed to demand constant noise, constant movement, and constant validation. In her final days, Diane had come to terms with the life she had lived and the woman she had become. She had spent her career seeking love, connection, and meaning, but in the end, it was the quiet moments, the stillness, that had brought her the most fulfillment. She had come to understand that love, in its truest form, did not require constant attention or validation. It was something that existed in the spaces between, in the moments of silence and solitude. Diane's story was not one of grand gestures or dramatic finales. It was a story of quiet strength, of a woman who had faced her demons and emerged, not unscathed, but wiser. It was a story of a woman who had spent her life living for others, but in her final years had chosen to live for herself. Diane Keaton's legacy is not just in the film she made or the characters she portrayed. It is in the way she lived, the way she navigated the complexities of fame, and the way she ultimately found peace in the silence of her own heart. Her story reminds us that the greatest strength is often found in the quietest moments, and that sometimes the most powerful statement is the one left unsaid. In the end, Diane Keaton's life was defined not by the role she played on screen, but by the quiet, personal moments that marked the final chapters of her story. She had spent her entire career navigating the spotlight, the pressure, and the expectations of a world that often saw her as a symbol, but never truly understood the woman behind the image. Her decision to step away from that world, to retreat into a life of solitude and reflection, was not one of weakness or defeat. It was a conscious choice to reclaim her own narrative, to take control of her own story in a way that few would ever fully understand. Her final days were a testament to the strength that had defined her throughout her life. Diane's decision to leave Hollywood behind, to step away from the noise and the glamour, was an act of incredible courage. She had spent decades being celebrated for her ability to perform, to entertain, to be the woman the world wanted her to be. But in her last years, she chose to be just Diane Keaton, the woman who had always been more than just the character she portrayed. She chose to find peace on her own terms, in a way that was deeply personal and deeply meaningful. And yet, even as she stepped away from the public eye, Diane's legacy continued to grow. The impact she had made on the world, on the film she had helped shape, on the countless lives she had touched, could not be erased by her absence. Diane Keaton's name would live on, not just in the role she had played, but in the way she had lived her life, boldly, unapologetically, and with a sense of purpose that few could ever hope to match. Her final moments, spent in the quiet of her home, reflected the essence of who she had been, a woman who had lived her life with grace, with intelligence, and with a quiet strength that had carried her through the highs and lows of fame, love, and loss. In those final days, there was no need for grand gestures or dramatic goodbyes. Diane had lived the way she had always wanted to live, on her own terms, without the expectations of others. And in doing so, she left behind a legacy that was more powerful than any role she had ever played. For those who had known her well, Diane Keaton's death marked the end of an era defined by a woman who had been both an icon and a mystery. To the world, she had been the actress who had made us laugh, cry, and think. But to those who truly knew her, she was so much more than that. She was a woman who had spent her life searching for meaning, for connection, and for peace. And in her final moments, she had found all of those things. As we reflect on Diane Keaton's life, we are reminded of the power of quiet strength, the importance of living authentically, and the beauty of choosing to leave a world behind when it no longer serves us. Diane's legacy is not just in the role she played, but in the way she chose to live, the way she faced her fears, and the way she found peace in the face of a world that demanded so much from her. Her story is one that will continue to resonate with those who admired her, those who loved her, and those who saw her as a symbol of what it means to live with authenticity and grace. Diane Keaton's legacy is a gift to us all, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that are left untold, the ones that are whispered in the quiet spaces between the noise. And as we say goodbye to Diane, we are left with one final lesson, that the greatest gift we can give ourselves is the courage to live on our own terms, to find peace in the silence, and to leave behind a legacy that is uniquely ours, one that speaks not just of the life we lived, but of the person we truly were. In the end, Diane Keaton's life was not just a story of fame or fortune, but of love, loss, and the pursuit of peace. And that, perhaps, is the greatest legacy of all.